I caught my cheating wife going with her lover to a luxury hotel. My blood boiled, but my mind remained cold, calculating. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was the humiliation of seeing, with my own eyes, the woman I once swore to love exchanging forbidden caresses with another man. The tight dress, the complicit smiles, the touching of hands at the reception. Everything there was a disgusting play, a parallel story that she wrote without imagining that the final chapter would be mine. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss, I didn't stoop to scenes of impulsive hatred. On the contrary, I watched that dirty spectacle with the serenity of someone who already had the perfect outcome in hand. They went up. The elevator closed slowly, as if mocking my presence, my helplessness. But I wasn't helpless. Quite the opposite. My firm hands held the divorce letter that was already ready, a complete dossier of the betrayal, the lie, the destruction of trust. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the beginning of a ruin. The room key was in my hands before they even got there. The waiter bought it. The reception, an unknowing accomplice. And so, the silver tray went up to the suite where my wife and her lover shared the luxury of a costly sin. The moment they opened the letter was the exact moment panic took over them. The lover, previously sure of his conquest, lost the color in his face. My wife trembled. This wasn't a simple, "I'm breaking up with you." It was a warning that their lives, their reputations, their false stories were about to be uprooted. Her desperation was visible. His hands trembled, his breathing quickened. She looked around as if she could escape an inevitable fate. But there was no way out. I was already ahead of every play. For the first time, she understood what real fear was. Not the fear of being discovered, but the fear of the consequences. The lover, now more worried about himself than about her, got up hurriedly, trying to reason. He knew this was a losing game. He knew I had more than just a simple divorce planned. But it was when she read the last line of the letter that her expression changed from terror to true panic. Her face drained of color, her throat closed, and all she could manage was a single whisper of disbelief. She ran to her cell phone. Tried to call me. I didn't answer. Tried to send me a message. I didn't even open it. All she could do was wonder how far I had come, what more I knew, what more I was willing to do. The feeling of absolute control she thought she had over her life collapsed there, in that luxury suite that became a captivity of her own fault. But the real blow was yet to come. It wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't just the loss of home, comfort, status. Her true punishment was something she never expected. Something that was not immediate, but that corroded, destroyed, killed slowly. Because betrayal doesn't end when it's discovered. It echoes, spreads, burns inside. And this time, she wasn't the only one who would suffer. I wouldn't just come out of this story clean. I would emerge victorious. I would go free. I would leave renewed. And the most ironic of all. In the end, when everything seemed lost, I found something I never thought I would have again, a new love. A true, pure love, without lies, without shadows. And when my ex-wife looked at me in the future, alone, regretful, destroyed by her own poison, she would understand that some betrayals are not just avenged. They are transformed into rebirth. But how did I get there? How was her fall greater than anyone expected? And, most importantly, how can a betrayed man turn things around in an epic way and still find love after the worst moment of his life? The story that unfolds next is not just about betrayal. It's about justice. About destiny. About how some truths can't be buried and how, in the end, life always finds a way to balance the scales. Welcome to the channel where the truth about betrayal is revealed without filters. Here, we do not support, romanticize or justify infidelity. Our stories are fictional, but the lesson is real. Betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and has relentless consequences. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of twists and turns and justice being served. Adjust the headset, take a deep breath and get ready to hear a shocking story. Lucas has always been a man of principle. Since he was young, he carried with him the firmness of someone who believes in loyalty as a non-negotiable pillar in any relationship. He worked hard, built a solid career and, above all, valued mutual respect. He and Laura had been together for years, a marriage that for many was the perfect example of partnership and complicity. When they met, everything seemed to flow naturally, effortlessly, as if they were made for each other. Laura, with her sweet and at the same time engaging way, won Lucas over from the first moment. She was the type of woman who knew how to light up a room, had a striking presence and always charming speech, capable of involving anyone around her. Her energy was magnetic, and Lucas felt lucky to have her by his side. The beginning of the relationship was intense, full of promises and shared dreams, moments that seemed eternal, as if time stopped when they were together. The life they built together seemed stable, a comfortable home, mutual friends, weekend dinners and enthusiastically planned trips. Lucas liked the routine, the comfort of knowing he had someone to share his challenges and achievements with. Laura, in turn, was a woman who liked to be admired, always looking for new things, surprises, something that made her feel special all the time. He never bothered about it, on the contrary, he always made a point of showing how much he valued her. Unexpected gifts, sincere compliments, attention to small details. He believed that all of this was enough to keep the marriage solid, unshakable. But there was something in Laura's eyes that, over time, began to change. Small gestures, subtle reactions, a certain distance that seemed imperceptible to anyone but him. Lucas's work demanded a lot from him, and perhaps this was one of the factors that began to create a small crack in the relationship. He was not an absent man, but at certain times, professional commitments took up a large part of his time. Laura understood, at least that's what he thought. She always said that she admired him, that she was proud of the dedicated man he was, but in the last few months, those words sounded empty, mechanical, as if they had lost their essence. He noticed that the conversations were no longer the same, the looks seemed to escape each other, and the silence between them became more and more frequent. But Lucas, being the rational man that he was, always tried to find logical explanations for everything. Maybe it was just a phase, maybe they were tired of the routine, maybe time together, a trip, could bring them closer together. He wanted to believe it was just that. Laura, however, was harder to read. She had always been intense, passionate, full of desire, but now she seemed scattered, restless, as if something inside her was changing and Lucas couldn't keep up. In the moments when he tried to pull her close, he felt like she was distant, with her mind somewhere else. Messages that were previously spontaneous now became rare. Unreasonable calls, which were once frequent, were now less and less common. Her touch, once warm, was beginning to feel calculated, as if she were there out of obligation, not desire. But Lucas still refused to see the obvious. I preferred to believe that the love they had was greater than any difficult phase. He didn't want to see the signs, because that would mean accepting that something was falling apart, and he wasn't ready for that. The nights with Laura were still filled with the comfort of having her there, but Lucas felt that, somehow, she was no longer there. Her smell on the pillow, the way she touched her hair before going to sleep, everything was still there, but the feeling of security she always had seemed to slip through her fingers. Small details began to accumulate, becoming more and more evident. Her cell phone, which used to be left around the house, was now always nearby, protected by passwords that didn't exist before. Going out with friends, previously sporadic, became more frequent. The loose laugh she used to have when she was with him now came when she was on the phone, with someone he couldn't identify. Lucas wasn't a paranoid man, he was never the controlling type, but that uncomfortable feeling was growing inside him. A primal instinct, a silent warning that made him question everything. He remembered the times he tried to get closer and received evasive responses. The nights when he looked for her in bed and found only a body present, but an absent mind. Still, he insisted. He was trying to rekindle something that, perhaps, had already been extinguished without him noticing. The moments when she really looked at him were rare, and when they happened, he saw something different there, something he couldn't completely decipher. He wondered what was happening, but refused to believe it could be what his heart was beginning to fear. Friends noticed that there was something strange in the air, but no one said anything. Just exchanged looks, uncomfortable silences. Lucas tried to ignore it. He wanted to believe that his marriage was solid, that Laura was still the same woman who had chosen to share her life with him. He didn't know that some truths, when discovered, change everything forever. That some wounds never heal completely. That some stories, however beautiful they may seem, are built on quicksand. But for now, he still clung to hope, unaware that reality was about to overwhelm him. The days passed and Lucas felt something inside him stirring, a silent discomfort, a restlessness that he couldn't name, but that became impossible to ignore. Laura was still by her side, sharing the routine they had built together, but something about her seemed distant, unreachable. The gaze that previously met his with tenderness now looked away in a hurry, avoiding any depth. The answers were short, automatic, as if each conversation were an obligation to be fulfilled, a script rehearsed to maintain appearances. Lucas was not a man to create paranoia, he had never been jealous, he always believed that true love was based on trust, and he trusted Laura. At least, I trusted him until that moment. The first time he felt something was really wrong was on an ordinary night, after a long day at work. He returned home earlier than usual, determined to surprise Laura with a special dinner. He bought flowers, prepared his favorite dish and waited. But Laura didn't show up at the time she usually arrived. When he finally walked through the door, the smile he gave Lucas was rehearsed, lifeless, without that glow that he recognized so well. She said she was tired, that it had been a long day and that she needed to take a shower. Lucas just watched, without saying anything, noticing how she avoided looking at him directly. He felt a knot form in his stomach, a feeling he had never had before, as if a part of him already knew the truth before the facts were even revealed. Patterns began to repeat themselves. Messages answered late, calls not answered, excuses becoming increasingly vague. Her phone, previously left on the table, now never left her hands. Lucas tried to rationalize, tried to tell himself that he was exaggerating, that the stress could be affecting his perception. But then, he started to notice details that he hadn't paid attention to before. The smell of a different perfume on her clothes, a slight change in the way she got ready to go out, the way she seemed to always be busy, always with something urgent to do away from him. Lucas decided not to confront her right away. Instead, he watched. I noticed how she dressed up more for certain outings, how she smiled when looking at her cell phone, how her excuses for coming back late became more frequent. Something inside him screamed not to ignore it, not to pretend that it wasn't happening. He knew he needed the truth, no matter how much he feared what he might find. And then came the day when reality imposed itself in a cruel way, with no room for doubt. It was a Friday night, and Laura had once again said she would go out with her friends. Lucas pretended he didn't care, wished her good night and watched her leave in a dress he hadn't seen in a while. A piece that he had always considered special, because he had given it to him himself, and that was now being used for another purpose, for someone else. He waited a few minutes before grabbing his car keys and leaving. I didn't know exactly what I would do, I didn't have a clear plan, just the desire to know the truth. The discomfort he had carried for so long needed a definitive answer. He drove through the streets, attentive, without rushing, just following the intuition that guided him. When he saw Laura enter a restaurant he knew well, he felt his chest tighten. She wasn't with friends. The man waiting for her at the table was already there, smiling at her in a way that Lucas recognized, because that was exactly how he used to look at her. He parked the car in an inconspicuous spot and watched. Dinner wasn't just dinner. The way the hands were on the table, the way the looks lingered, the way the smiles came easily. Lucas felt his blood boil, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, but he forced himself to stay there. I needed to see how far this would go. They finished their meal and left together. Lucas kept his distance, eyes fixed on their movements. The subtle touch on Laura's waist, the way she leaned in to hear what the other was saying, the light laughs that escaped. And then, the definitive confirmation. The man called a taxi, opened the door for her, and they both got in. Lucas didn't think, he just followed the vehicle from a distance, as if he was in a trance. The journey was short, and when the car stopped in front of a luxury hotel, everything around it seemed to dissolve. Lucas's heart was beating so hard that he felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to be mistaken, wanted this to be a mistake, an absurd coincidence, but there was no denying what was in front of him. Laura and that man entered the hotel together, without hesitation, without apparent guilt. Lucas remained in the car for a long time, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. The betrayal was there, wide open, with no room for excuses. He felt anger, yes, but more than that, he felt a deep emptiness, as if something inside him had been ripped away without warning. The woman he loved, the one he trusted without reservation, was now in a hotel room with another man. What hurt was not just the act itself, but everything it represented. Years of history, promises made, the certainty that they had something true. Everything falling apart there, in front of him. But he wouldn't make a fuss. I wouldn't go into the hotel to confront them. That wasn't the kind of man he was. Instead, he picked up his cell phone, took a deep breath, and sent a message. Something short, direct, without beating around the bush. A message that Laura would see as soon as her night ended. A message that would leave no doubt that he knew. That she couldn't pretend anymore. And then, he hung up the phone, laid his head on the car seat and closed his eyes for a moment. The pain was still there, burning, suffocating. But at the same time, something inside him began to transform. He still didn't know exactly what he would do next. But he knew Laura would never forget the way he chose to deal with it. The silence of the hotel room was shattered by the sound of the envelope being hastily ripped open. Laura was shaking, her sweaty hands sliding over the paper as her eyes ran over each line with a feverish rush. Her lover, sitting on the edge of the bed, watched her with an expression filled with growing discomfort. The tone of her voice was shaky, almost inaudible, as she repeated the reading in whispers, trying to process the depth of what was before her. Lucas not only knew, not only had discovered the betrayal, but he had gone further. Far beyond. She looked up at the man beside her, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling in a frantic rhythm. He, however, remained motionless, his gaze fixed on her, but without the same obvious panic. There was a tension full of unspoken questions, of fears that spread like a silent poison. Laura blinked several times, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare, but there was no escape. The letter was real. What was written there was real. Her lover leaned in slightly, trying to pull the paper from her hands, but she held on tight, her voice booming in a choked tone of disbelief. How did he find out? How was this possible? How could Lucas know something that not even she herself had fully understood until that moment? He didn't just reveal the betrayal. He revealed that he knew everything about her lover. About every hidden detail. About every lie told. And, most importantly, about something she never, ever could have predicted. He knew that the man sitting next to her was not just a casual lover, a passing involvement, a momentary escape from reality. Lucas knew that this man was more than a stranger who had infiltrated their lives. He was the man who, years ago, before Laura even met Lucas, was already part of her past in a way that now, faced with this revelation, made everything even more cruel. The truth that Luke exposed in that letter was a blow that pierced the soul. That man wasn't just a lover. He was someone Laura met in a period where her choices were impulsive, out of control. Someone who, without her knowing, had left scars much deeper than she imagined. Someone who, at that time, disappeared without explanation, without a trace, without even a goodbye. The man who, years ago, was just a forgotten name in your mind, a mistake from the past. And now, here, in front of her, it was revealed as something much worse. The words in the letter burned his eyes. Lucas knew. She knew that this man had been part of her life in a way she could never imagine. He knew because he had investigated, because he had gone deep where she had never had the courage to look. The truth was crueler than any betrayal. Because the man with whom Laura shared that night, who touched her body as if it were his own, who whispered empty promises in her ear, was the same man who, long ago, had been responsible for one of the greatest tragedies of her life. The memory came as a shock, a weight crushing his chest. The accident. The hazy period, the months erased from his memory. The faces of people who were never part of your life again. And he is gone. And now, there. As? Why? The lover, noticing the sudden change in her expression, touched her arm, his voice filled with false calm, trying to understand what was happening. But Laura couldn't answer. Because everything made sense now. Lucas discovered who he was. Found out what he did. And, worse, he discovered that Laura, without knowing it, had thrown herself into the arms of the very man who, years before, irreversibly destroyed her life. It was an ironic punishment from fate. It was an invisible trap that surrounded her without her noticing. The lover, still not understanding the gravity of what was happening, tried to take the letter again, but Laura moved away. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Every detail of that night now took on greater meaning, greater pain. She felt her body shake, bile rising in her throat, her mind spinning in despair. The past had returned to swallow everything. Lucas knew even before she did. I knew it before I could help it. Before I could choose. And now everything was in his hands. The man she cheated on wasn't just a cuckolded husband. He was a man who plotted his revenge in a calculated manner. And she knew that this was far from the end. Laura felt her hands sweat, her breath caught in her chest, the air became heavy around her. The hotel room, which had once felt like a refuge, was now a suffocating prison, every object a mute witness to the disaster unfolding before it. The words in the letter still pulsed through his mind like a deafening echo. She tried to look up at the man next to her, but something inside her refused to look at him in the same way. He wasn't just a lover. He was a ghost from the past, a buried mistake that Lucas had somehow unearthed and turned into a perfect trap. Laura tried to speak, but her throat closed up, her eyes watering with confusion and shame. He felt his heart beating hard against his chest, as if his own body was reacting to the weight of that revelation in a way that his mind still couldn't completely process. Her lover noticed her hesitation and leaned closer, the touch of his hand on her arm was now cold, without the warmth and security that had previously given her a false feeling of adventure. He wanted to know what was happening, he wanted to understand the reason for that scared expression, the way she was shaking without control. But Laura couldn't formulate a coherent response. All she knew was that nothing made sense anymore. Everything that happened between them was nothing more than a perverse game of fate, a cruel irony that trapped her in a web that she herself spun without realizing it. Every word in Lucas's letter felt like a blow, another piece in the puzzle she didn't know she was putting together until that moment. She stood up, her mind spinning, her legs unsteady, her eyes fixed on the door as if she needed to escape that place, but not knowing where to run. Her lover stood up behind her, trying to hold her arm, calling her name, asking what was wrong. But how could she respond? How could he say that he had slept with a man who, years ago, had been involved in the most devastating episode of his life? How could he explain that, without knowing it, he had given himself to the person who, in some way, was connected to his greatest pain? And how did Lucas find out before she did? How did he set all this up, waiting for the right moment to completely collapse it? His entire body was shaking, the thick air made every breath difficult. The lover insisted, wanted answers, wanted to understand why she was holding the letter so tightly, why she seemed ready to fall apart. But Laura couldn't answer. She felt the weight of bad choices crushing her shoulders, regret burning her skin. The man in front of her, who until minutes ago had been the symbol of forbidden desire, now seemed like a stranger, someone who should never have entered her life again. She wanted to scream, she wanted to ask for everything to be a mistake, for someone to say that this was nothing more than a nightmare. But the reality was cruel. And Lucas, even without being there, was in control of everything. His phone vibrated. The screen lit up with Lucas' name. Laura's heart sank in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, but answered, her voice weak, insecure, as if she knew he was already predicting her every reaction. On the other side, his voice was calm, firm, without apparent anger, which made everything even more frightening. He said he hoped she had read everything, that now she finally understood what it meant to be deceived, to be betrayed in a way that hurt beyond skin, beyond pride. He knew she was suffocating, he knew that at that moment all she wanted was to go back in time, erase every wrong choice. But time does not forgive. Just as he wouldn't forgive either. Laura tried to argue, tried to say something, but her voice broke. Lucas didn't give him room for excuses, for justifications. He knew nothing she said would change what happened. He just wanted her to feel. I felt the helplessness of someone who sees their life falling apart without being able to do anything. He felt the butterflies in his stomach when he realized that everything he had built was nothing more than an illusion. Feel the humiliation of knowing that the person who betrayed you not only discovered it, but also reversed the betrayal in a precise, surgical, fatal blow. On the other end of the line, Lucas took a deep breath, and his voice came like a final sentence. He didn't want anything more from her. The divorce was already underway. He wouldn't make scandals, he wouldn't shout, he wouldn't ask for explanations. He would just move on, leaving behind a woman who was no longer the person he once loved. But Laura wasn't ready for that answer. She felt a growing panic as she realized that, for the first time, Lucas wasn't reacting with anger, wasn't asking for anything. He was just leaving her behind, as if she were a mistake to be erased. And that hurt more than any fight, more than any accusation. She tried to say something, anything, but the call ended. She stood there, holding the phone as if it were a piece of the life she had just lost. Her lover watched her, waiting for an explanation, but she could no longer look at him. He was part of the problem, he was a reflection of the worst decision he ever made. Laura felt hot tears fall down her face, not from sadness, but from despair. The feeling of emptiness was unbearable. Lucas hadn't just discovered the betrayal. He had stripped her of any control she thought she had over her own life. And now, as she stared at her own reflection in the bedroom mirror, she saw someone she no longer recognized. Silence weighed on the environment. The lover finally understood that something bigger was happening. But it was no longer a safe haven. He was nothing more than a mistake, a twist of fate that Laura should never have made. And now, for the first time, she didn't know what to do. Because there was no going back. Because everything that was solid had collapsed. Because cheating didn't just destroy the marriage. Destroyed herself. Laura remained motionless for a long time, the letter still crumpled in her shaking hands, her eyes glazed over in the mirror's reflection as the weight of the destruction she had caused sank into her mind. The lover beside him moved uneasily, crossing his arms, waiting for some explanation, but there was nothing more to say. The betrayal that once seemed like a well-kept secret was now an open, exposed and irrecoverable wound. The air felt heavy inside that hotel room that minutes ago had been a refuge and now became a suffocating reminder of everything I had lost. She felt a lump in her throat, a feeling of suffocation that wouldn't leave her, as if her own skin was burning in the face of the truth. She needed to get out of there. Her mind screamed for air, for movement, for anything that would take her away from that trapped feeling. Without looking back, she grabbed her bag and walked through the bedroom door, ignoring her lover's calls. He said her name, once, twice, 3 times, but she didn't even look back. Overly lit hallways seemed to stretch endlessly as their footsteps echoed on the marble floors. The elevator took seconds to arrive, but each one felt like an age. When the doors opened, Laura entered and pressed the downstairs button repeatedly, as if she could force time to move faster. His mind was spinning, his stomach was churning, and for the first time, despair was turning into something other than guilt. It was a loss. The real and irreversible loss of what was once their world. As she left the hotel, the cold early morning wind hit her skin, breaking her out of the daze she was in. He walked aimlessly, his heels echoing on the empty sidewalks, the streets lit by streetlights and closed shop windows. The cell phone was heavy in his hand, but Lucas's number could no longer be dialed. He had closed any possibility of dialogue, any chance of retraction. For the first time, Laura realized that this wasn't just a moment of anger, a passing impulse. Lucas was really gone. And that realization went through her like a blade. Almost without realizing it, her steps took her to the house where she lived. The door was locked, the lights were off, as if the place no longer belonged to him. He rummaged through his bag for the key, but his hands were shaking so much that he dropped everything on the floor. He knelt down, gathering the scattered objects, feeling the tears fall hotly down his face. When he finally managed to open the door and entered, the silence was deafening. The familiar smell, the organized room, everything in exactly the same place, except for Lucas' absence. He was no longer there. And more than that, he would never come back. She walked slowly down the hallway, as if each step made her sink into quicksand. In the bedroom, he found the bed intact, as if no one had slept there that night. But what really stopped her was the absence of Lucas's clothes in the closet. The open, empty drawers. The shelves that were once filled with her belongings were now just blank spaces. He had left no trace, had given no chance for an apology, for a regret that came too late. He had simply left, decided there was nothing left there for him. That silence swallowed her whole. The pain was different from what I had felt before. It wasn't just guilt. It was the certainty that he had destroyed something that he could never rebuild. She tried to sit up in bed, but her knees gave out and she fell sideways, hugging the sheets that still smelled like him, her face pressed against the cold fabric. The tears that came were not controllable, they were not silent. There were suffocated sobs, pure despair of someone who realizes they threw away everything that really mattered. His betrayal had not just been physical, it had been a betrayal against everything they had built together, against the man who never deserved it. The minutes dragged by, and Laura remained there, without the strength to move, without knowing how to reverse a fate that had already been sealed. The phone vibrated beside him, and for a moment his heart raced, irrational hope rising. But it wasn't Lucas. It was the lover. His name flashed on the screen, insistent, calling her back to a mistake she no longer wanted to make. He dropped the phone next to the bed and closed his eyes, trying to breathe. But the truth was inescapable. There was no turning back. Hours later, when morning arrived without warning, Laura forced herself to get up. The swollen face, the red eyes, the weight in the chest still unbearable. He dragged himself to the bathroom, staring at his own reflection. She looked like a stranger. The phone vibrated once again, and this time she picked it up to look. But it wasn't Lucas. It was an email. An email from his lawyer. The divorce had already officially begun. She clutched her cell phone to her chest, closing her eyes as the air ran out of her again. There was no running from him. Lucas had even taken away from her the chance to explain herself. There would be no more conversations, no more requests, no more excuses. All she could do now was accept what was left. Just the wreckage of something that once was your marriage. And the worst of all. She knew Lucas wouldn't look back. He would move on. Without her. Lucas left that story without looking back. The divorce was signed quickly, without arguments, without desperate requests, without attempts at reconciliation. He would make no room for empty apologies, for tears that no longer meant anything. While Laura tried to pick up the pieces of what she destroyed, he was rebuilding himself. Not overnight, because betrayal is not something that can be overcome easily. But unlike her, who was stuck in the past, Lucas opened up to a new future. He understood that life cannot be lived carrying a grudge, but rather learning from the blows he receives. And that's how he moved on. The new phase of his life began without fanfare, without urgency. First, rediscovering his own identity, his own desires that, for so long, were put aside due to a marriage that he believed to be solid. Then, allowing yourself to meet new people, without rushing, without fear. It was at a casual event, without any pretensions, that he met someone. It wasn't a search, it wasn't a need to fill a void. But it happened. Unlike Laura, this woman was not an illusion, she was not a broken mirror of false promises. She appeared at the right time, when Lucas had already understood that he deserved more. Someone who didn't just see him as a safe haven, but a real partner, someone who didn't look for excitement in secrets and lies, but in the genuine construction of something real. This time, he knew he was with someone who wouldn't destroy him. While Lucas followed his life in new ways, Laura faced the consequences of her choices. The lover, the one who for a brief time seemed to be everything she was missing, has disappeared. As expected, he was not a pillar, he was not a refuge. He was just a man who found a space in the chaos that Laura created. The moment stability collapsed, he didn't stay to pick up the pieces. He went on with his life, just like all the others that appear when the promise of the forbidden is exciting, but that disappear when reality imposes itself. Laura realized, too late, that she hadn't won anything. I had lost everything. The days passed, and the house that was once full of memories became an empty space. The furniture remained in place, but the home no longer existed. The time that was once filled with a predictable routine was now a huge vacuum. The messages I received were no longer from Lucas, the good mornings, the conversations about the day, the plans for the future, everything evaporated. The divorce turned her into a stranger in her own life. And the most painful thing of all was knowing that it was his own hand that signed that sentence. No explanation, no justification, nothing would bring Lucas back. The love that once existed was not strong enough to survive betrayal. Trust, once broken, could never be restored. The friends, those who had admired the couple as an example for so long, gradually moved away. No one wanted to be involved in an announced shipwreck, no one wanted to hear the lamentations of someone who had everything and threw it away on an impulse. The calls became less frequent, the invitations disappeared, and Laura found herself alone. Time passed, but the regret did not lessen. There wasn't a day that went by that he didn't think about everything he did, everything he lost. What once seemed like an exciting choice was now an unbearable burden. And the worst thing was knowing that, somewhere, Lucas was okay. He was happy. And she, for the first time in years, wasn't part of it. Lucas, on the other hand, looked at the past without regret, but with learning. He no longer carried the pain of what happened, because he knew how to transform betrayal into strength. He didn't let Laura's infidelity define him, or destroy his ability to love and trust again. He learned that some losses are deliverances, that some stories need to be ended so that something better can begin. And that's exactly what happened. The end of that phase of Lucas's life was not marked by sadness or revenge. It was marked by his ability to move forward, to find happiness that was no longer linked to what he believed to be eternal. He rebuilt his life, his love, his trust. While Laura was stuck in what she destroyed, he built something new. In the end, the greatest punishment for those who cheat is not abandonment, it is not material loss, it is not scandal. The real punishment is watching, from afar, the person you destroyed be happy without you. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? What is your opinion on everything that happened? Leave your comment and share your impressions. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to do so now so you don't miss any new stories. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, because we know that trust, once broken, will never be the same again. See you in the next story.